I work as a professional babysitter. One of the children I look after has recently started hiking. I decided to take them on a very steep trail at Salt Fork State Park. After parking at the very beginning of the trail, we set off in the direction of Hoseka Cave. The trail at the entrance is about a half-mile, so I chose it for a day hike. We chose this trail because it used to be very popular and crowded when we went there. However, this summer, the trail was badly damaged by a severe storm. To our surprise, the trail was much more difficult and completely empty. This was because a small construction crew was working on a bridge that was barely visible from the top of the trail. This was despite the fact that the entire width of the trail was eroded to only a foot wide and the creek bed was probably 6-12 feet deep. He was very athletic and I was confident in his abilities, so he was looking forward to our new adventure. We landed on a platform from which we could see the entire cave. There were many fallen trees around the platform. Actually, the cave was closed at this point, but we had walked so much that we decided to get off the platform and walk a few hundred meters deeper into the cave. We had spent most of our time in this area because of the difficulty level, so we knew exactly what the area was. There are tree roots just below the platform through which you can descend to the left or right. It's also worth noting that Hoseka Cave is more like a cliff with overhanging rocks and a small waterfall flowing right through the center. It's not a creepy enclosed cave. It's very open and very beautiful. When we entered the cave, we saw that there were candles burning on a large rock with a heart carved into it. I ignored it, thinking it was someone's date or something. The stone made me want to climb to the top. There I noticed 2 more candles and 3 smaller stones that someone had stacked in a pile. I don't know why, but I definitely felt weird at this point. Then I found a small puddle full of baby salamanders, and he wanted to catch them. I was so happy to see him for the first time in years that I didn't dare tell him it was time to leave. We spent about an hour catching salamanders, and I watched him having a lot of fun. After a while, we decided it was time to leave and went back to the platform. The wet undershirt was hanging between the roots of the tree in the center. It hadn't been there before. He noticed it and even pointed it out, but didn't realize the gravity of the situation we were in. At that moment, I was sure of 2 things. First, someone was watching us. Not us watching them, but them watching us. And second, they could have been hiding in the woods. They made themselves invisible, but left something behind so we could find them. Running back down the narrow road was impossible, and I wasn't about to tell him we might be in danger. I told him to keep going and encouraged him to keep going. Again and again he succeeded, and naturally he seemed to get faster. There was no one else to be seen on the road. Finally, we walked back to the car, and I immediately locked the door. As we were driving out of the park, a very dirty-looking man, who appeared to be about 30 years old, came out of the woods and looked at me with the blankest expression I had ever seen. As I walked past him, he followed me with his eyes and head. He kept looking at me until I could no longer see him in my rearview mirror. And now I know the first and second facts are true. I couldn't get his face out of my head for a few days, and then it haunted me for weeks and bothered me so much that I considered counseling. I tried to convince myself that maybe we had just interrupted his bathing and he had gone camping and didn't want to scare us. After all, this crazy guy could do whatever he wanted while we were catching salamanders. But there was no way I could understand why he was looking me in the eye. The guy I took with me on the walk still doesn't know how panicked I was. He still thinks about it regularly, and overall it was a very positive experience for him. But for me, it was one of the worst experiences of my life, and I still feel sick and anxious as I write these lines. My story took place in northern Italy in 2014. It was the beginning of September. A friend of mine suggested a little walk in the woods near his town. Of course, I agreed because I love hiking in nature. We packed our backpacks, took some food with us, and went there. My friend knew the area well, but he didn't bring a map or a flashlight. We weren't going to linger. As we got deeper into the forest, we passed some beautiful places, a small river, a few caves that we really explored. We had lunch and continued deeper into the forest. After about 30 minutes, we reached a pretty big crevice, but this was the scariest part. In this crevice were 4 or 5 people in regular clothes. They were just talking and laughing. It wasn't a satanic cult group. They weren't chanting horrible scriptures or praying in a circle. They were ordinary people, just like me and my friends, and they were just chatting. They were looking at us too, because there were no trees or rocks in the clearing to block their view, and they couldn't avoid us. We approached them and asked, "Hello, how are you?" No one responded. They just kept looking at us without saying anything. It was a big red light for both of us. We stopped and looked at our friend. He looked at me with concern. Then we did it again. "Hey." No one answered. I got worried and decided to turn around and walk back to the car. But shortly after we turned around and headed back to the car, we realized they were following us. I turned around and asked them, "Did we do something wrong?" But there was no response and they continued to follow us. We walked faster and faster, trying to get off the path as quickly as possible. They followed us all the way, and I think they were about 15 meters behind us. We panicked, looked at each other, and decided to run. As soon as we ran, they started running too. We were in very good shape and were doing our best to get closer to them. We still had another 40 minutes to get to the car. We were deep in the jungle, in the middle of nowhere. I felt completely helpless. We were halfway back. I began to realize that they were no longer behind us. I thought we were lucky to have lost them. Once we realized this, we hid in the overgrown bushes and just tried to listen. Silence. No footsteps. Not a sound. We sat there for a while longer, holding our breath, and finally managed to make it to the car. We jumped into the car and hurried out of there. The story didn't end there. When we came out of the woods onto the main road, we saw another car coming from the side road behind us. It was them. They drove after us again. At that point, we weren't sure if it was them, but they were driving behind us, almost sticking to our ass. Not many people visit this area. There were no cars here, except for my friend and one other car. And that car didn't have a license plate. To avoid driving back to my friend's house, we drove back to his town on every country road we could think of. And every time we turned off, they turned off too. When we reached the town, we made a U-turn and headed into the woods. We were very scared. We called the local police and asked them to check the area, but as far as we knew, there was no evidence, and we never heard from them again. We never saw them again, but for the next few days, we were paranoid. We didn't even try to leave the house. That's how I stopped camping for 4 years. I still don't know who they are, what they want, or why they are after us. I started getting post-traumatic stress disorder because of it. It was horrible. I hope I never see them again. While hiking the Appalachian Trail in northern Pennsylvania, a friend and I had just finished climbing a large hill and were packing lunch. We had planned to eat at a shelter 2 miles down the hill. After some discussion, we decided to eat there since the shelter had water. When we got there, we met a man we first mistook for another hiker. He was carrying an old backpack and looking for crumbs at the bottom of a bag of Fritos. He looked a little out of place. We asked him if he was backpacking or hiking. Without looking us in the eye, he just mumbled, "Backpacking," he muttered. We then asked him if he was going to hike part of the trail or the entire trail. In other words, is he going the whole trail? He looked at us strangely and said he was walking the whole trail. After talking some more and dodging our questions, he quickly got up and said he had to go. He packed his bag, and we asked him what his name was on the trail or if we could find it in the logbook. He clearly didn't know what we were talking about. "I don't know because everyone who hikes here knows the names of the trails and usually hikes this way," he said. When we explained what we meant, he said, "Well," he said this with an axe in his hand. We continued our hike and reached the campground. Once settled, we were awakened by the rustling of an axe in our backpacks. My friend and I were in hammocks, so I wrapped my backpack around the hammock tree and hung it up. There was a rustling in the hammock, and I shook the whole hammock. I yelled out, "Hey!" He peeked into my hammock, looked at me for a moment, and then ran off into the darkness. When I climbed out of the hammock, he was nowhere to be seen. He had only stolen a package of tuna and 2 sticks from his friend's backpack. I never saw him again. The strangest thing was that we went back to town and had lunch in the dining hall. Ol' Hatchet was on the run. There was a wanted poster on the door. Apparently, he had attacked several people 2 weeks before and left one bleeding to death. The whole story seemed very strange to me. We gave statements to the police, but they couldn't find anything, whether they caught him or not.